Hi there, people. So, I have a well-documented aversion to buzzwords like parasocial relationship or cognitive dissonance. And well, I really don't like these terms because I feel they're overused, and I try to distance myself from anyone who uses them unironically and seems to think that they grant them some kind of free scholarship to Harvard or something. Oh wow, you can say cognitive dissonance? I do find some of them kind of interesting. The one we're going to be going over today has actually been around for some time. That's right. Today we're going over the death of the author. Buckle up, because this one could get pretty gosh darn spicy. The author, in essence, is a theory which states that when you produce a work of art and let it out into the public can go all willy-nilly about it, and they don't have to consult you, the artist, and ask you what it means, because it's not as if creating a work of art you'd be the sole authority on what the work of art you created means, you know, because you made it. The death of the author essentially states that we must separate the art from the artist. And I think this can be healthy to do, especially if the artist has done some terrible things. Like, for instance, I really like Pootie Tang, the movie, but I do know that Louis C.K. worked on it. So, whenever I watch Pootie Tang, the movie, I kind of tend to, like, ignore that part and just pay attention to the funny parts with, you know, Wanda Sykes and Chris Rock, and kind of ignore that Louis C.K. was big in Pootie Tang. But it will always kind of haunt me. Oh yeah, Louis C.K. worked on this movie. I think that's kind of where the death of the author trips up. However, the main problem comes into play where, as with so many other buzzwords and thought experiments, the death of the author is accepted without question. Everyone is like, well, you can't judge this piece of art based on who made it and the frame of reference and perspective they had while going into it. You've got to judge this art as a solitary thing, a solitary experience, completely separated from the real world. And I think this kind of mindset is flawed for a few reasons. For one, the amount to which a work of art will be detached from the author or artist will vary depending on who made it. Propaganda, like an Ayn Rand novel or George Orwell's 1984, is extremely hard to separate from the author, given that they are trying to sell a political ideology. You know, I can't really read 1984 and go, well, George Orwell, you know, his life experience didn't really go into this book any, because I know it did. Like, that book just has George Orwell's presence all over it. And whether you agree or not that George Orwell is a piece of shit writer who never accomplished anything noteworthy in his entire empty life, you have to admit that 1984 is a politically charged, politically motivated book, and to dismiss it as merely something about, you know, like a sci-fi future world would be to kind of like miss the point of 1984. On the other hand, however, you have something like Blue Velvet from David Lynch. Now, he's gone on record in interviews to state that the movie is not a reference to his childhood whatsoever. He just made it up. And Blue Velvet is full of some really weird imagery and really weird shit. And David Lynch probably doesn't mean anything by any of it. Or if he does mean something by some of it, you know, the meaning is obscured behind layers and layers of subtext and meta-context until it's really hard to tell what the flip David Lynch is saying. But he probably just puts a bunch of weird shit in his movie because he thinks it's cool. Now, in that case, you can kind of detach the work from the author because the author isn't trying to say anything in particular. Blue Velvet's just a fun little dream noir. It's easier to separate the art from the artist in that case. On the other hand, though, I think the death of the author speaks to an intense hatred of art because it discredits people who put their time and effort into creating something noteworthy. Like, if I was looking at a Salvador Dali piece, I wouldn't really understand it unless I asked Salvador Dali directly, because he'd be like the main, you know, he'd know what it meant because he made it. I wouldn't know what it meant because I didn't make it, you know. That's just kind of how it is. And to deny that is like sheer lunacy. But some people do try to argue that the death of the author should always be taken into consideration. Now, take my work for instance. My work isn't very well recognized. Not too many people have written academic essays or anything on it. Oftentimes, a lot of people will come along and they'll be like, well, your comic is terrible. And they're always wrong about why my comic is terrible, because they don't understand my comic. And I, as the primary source on the comic, the only one who really understands it because I made it, I have to tell them, you know, you're not understanding so-and-so about the comic, you're just, like, stupid. But sometimes they refuse to acknowledge this, and they go on, oh, the death of the author, the death of the author. And this isn't just a personal thing. I think the death of the author is a highly offensive comment to anyone who, you know, takes the time to put something to paper. At the end of the day, art is a means of communication. And, you know, the artist will choose the most effective medium for communicating a message. And if the message isn't communicated, then the art really hasn't done its job. And there are two possible reasons for this. Either you, the viewer, are bad at interpreting art, or the artist is bad at communicating the message. It's either one, but usually it's probably that the viewer is kind of bad at interpreting the art, because not that many people are very good at, like, processing messages and whatnot. Again, it varies from thing to thing, but to imply that you can judge every single movie and every single painting and every single book ever made separate from the artist is, like, ludicrous. Half the fun of watching something or reading something is thinking, you know, trying to get kind of in the headspace of the author or artist or whatever, and thinking, like, you know, where are they coming from? You know, what led them to this decision? I think the death of the author is especially prevalent in today's culture of websites like TV Tropes. Now, I've ran into some people who unironically believe that you can boil every single movie and, like, TV show ever made into tropes that are listed on tvtropes.com. And I just don't think this is true. First and foremost, because these people tend to treat tropes like some kind of immutable law of the universe, rather than something which can be mutated or, you know, subverted, or you can just make up a new trope. It happens all the time. For instance, in ancient Greece, some of the oldest works of literature we have, the ancient plays and the like, they don't have all the tropes that modern literature has. Now, this is proof that over time, between the time of the Greeks and now, certain tropes were invented based on, you know, the socio-historical atmosphere that kind of mixed around back then. Tropes are invented all the time, new ones. New tropes are invented all the time. So there can be completely original works of fiction. You know, those come around less often these days, and I imagine that most of the people who worship TV tropes is some kind of flawless Bible of every single thing that's ever happened in a TV show or movie probably watch incredibly trope-heavy media like Rick and Morty or Two Broke Girls, which, you know, you're really not getting the full experience there. But on the other hand, watch a movie like Blue Velvet and tell me what tropes that movie really has. Now, this isn't to say that, of course, the Blue Velvet didn't invent some tropes of its own that other movies later copied. I'm sure it did. Blue Velvet is a very influential film. However, before Blue Velvet, there really was nothing like Blue Velvet. The same it's not just David Lynch. The same goes for a movie like Ghostbusters. Before Ghostbusters, there really was no movie like Ghostbusters. Ghostbusters probably invented dozens of tropes, but they weren't on TV Tropes before Ghostbusters came along. And I've posed an interesting thought experiment, because a lot of shows and movies tend to reference Carrie, Stephen King's, story of a girl with psychic telekinetic poltergeist powers. I say, go back to a version of TV Tropes in 1977 and look at that version of TV Tropes. It doesn't have the benefit of knowing how influential and impactful Carrie is going to be. So back in 1977, go to that version of TV Tropes. I know the internet doesn't exist yet, but this is a thought experiment. Go back to that version of TV Tropes and tell me which tropes Carrie engages in. There is currently a page on TV Tropes called Carrie, but it lists only tropes that started with Stephen King's novel and subsequent Brian De Palma movie Carrie, that didn't exist before Carrie, proving that you can invent tropes which were later picked up by other movies and shows. And really good movies and shows won't use as many tropes. And that said, I do think the widespread, unquestioning acceptance of this death of the author concept really gives you some fascinating insight. Like, for instance, it's kind of like how everyone just tends to accept Schrodinger's cat as some kind of inscrutable fact. Despite us not knowing whether there are parallel timelines, we have no way to measure that. We don't know if there are a million other versions of me out there. It's fun to think about. You make a choice and two separate universes get created, but we don't know if that's true or not, because we're always just in one universe. So there's really no way to tell if that's true or not. Now, it could be, of course, that this is just the only timeline. That's equally a possibility. Whenever Schrodinger came up with Schrodinger's cat, he actually made it up to prove that quantum physics is really stupid, which I'd have to agree. I don't think a cat can be simultaneously dead and alive, because I don't live in make-believe land, and I understand that there is an objective reality. Either the cat is dead or it's alive. Likewise, I don't think particles can be in two places at once. I just think that scientists haven't figured out where the particle is yet. They might never figure it out, but it's not in two places at once, because according to the laws of our universe, that's pretty much impossible. And, if it can't be explained in two sentences or less, I'm not just going to accept it blindly as fact. It needs to be explained in a simple, understandable manner to me, and if it can't, then I'm not going to buy into it. In much the same way that I don't believe a particle can exist in two locations or states at once, I don't believe that a movie can be simultaneously good and simultaneously bad. For instance, suppose that I think Rick and Morty is like one of the worst shows ever made. Without a doubt, it is a crime against animation. Now suppose someone else comes along and they're like, but I'm a fan of Rick and Morty, and I think Rick and Morty is good. If I were a pansy who, thought that art was subjective, I would probably be like, oh, well, I just have my opinion and he just has his. But actually, I look at cartoons and books and stuff the same way I look at, like, the periodic table of elements. I believe that quality is an innate property. I believe there are things which are inherently funny, inherently scary, and so on, that appeal to our, tiny little monkey brains. And I don't believe that something can exist in a state of being good and being bad at the same time. I think quality is as much a characteristic of something as, like, weight. You can't have an element weigh a certain amount and at the same time weigh a completely different amount, because we live in an objective reality where there are such things as facts. And if this can apply to things like the periodic table of the elements, I see no reason why it shouldn't apply to movies and books and like that. That's why I think you can rank all the movies ever made into a completely objective list where you just go down, like, how much quality is there to this thing? It'd be a huge task, of course, but you can do it, and, I wouldn't be one to tell you that you were wrong. I probably would be one to tell you that you were wrong, now that I think about it, because people tend to have disagreements about this for some reason. But I think it's important to apply the scientific method to the media we consume instead of using weird hackneyed literary tropes like the death of the author. Overall, I think it's important to listen to artists about what they mean instead of coming up with some weird explanation as to what you think it means. If you watch, like, I don't know, Tommy Boy, and you come to the conclusion that it's about segregation, you're probably just not that good at watching movies or understanding movies. And that's your problem. It's not the artist's problem for not pandering to your weird view of what the thing means, you know. It's just like not. Now, like I said, there are outliers, like David Lynch, who choose actively to kind of make it, you know, like a fun guessing game, like, you know, you figure out what Blue Velvet means. But not everyone's like this. Some people just want to tell a coherent story, and to do this, they kind of have to get across a message. And if you're like, oh, well, I'll interpret it how I want to, that's kind of selfish. And maybe, you know, instead of trying to make up your own story from someone else's story, how about you make your own story? You know, I think the death of the author is kind of created by the plebeians who, you know, don't make art and whatnot. And they're just like, well, you know, I'm kind of making my own story out of someone else's story. I don't have to make my own product. I don't have to make my own stuff. I do think that the idea that no art is original is patently ludicrous. You know, you can say, oh, all the ideas were done in the 90s. Like, they really weren't. Take Panos Cosmatos' Beyond the Black Rainbow, for instance. There's an example of an original plot. It's not even that hard a plot to follow. It's probably not even that hard a plot to make up. Before Beyond the Black Rainbow, there wasn't a movie about a bald lizard guy who keeps this girl in this underground facility and does weird psychic experiments with her. There wasn't a movie like that. That's Beyond the Black Rainbow. It's an original movie. It's an original concept. I think that's just kind of an excuse we make up for garbage like Rick and Morty that panders to the lowest common denominator by always referencing all these tropes on tvtropes.com and, you know, referencing other pop culture properties until it lacks a distinct identity that it can call its own. But I think we should ask for more than that. I think we should ask for intellectual property with distinct, recognizable, original designs and feels and things. And I don't think that no art is original. I think you can have originality, you know. And I'm not one to say that, like, you should extend copyright to an insane degree to protect people who create original work. I think the public domain is a nice innovation, but I do think that at the same time, creating a piece of art does take a substantial amount of effort and talent, unless you're Dan Harmon and Justin Roiland, in which case you just get into it because you have a lot of money. I guess that's the second option. In either case, I think the death of the author is a pretty shaky idea. It applies in some cases, like I said, Blue Velvet, and in other cases it really just like falls apart because there's a message that the movie wants to impart upon you, and if you don't pay any attention, then you just won't get the movie, and that's no fun. So the next time you watch a movie, try engaging with it. A while back I was contacted by a group of insane SpongeBob fans who stood by this garbage cartoon aimed at 5-year-olds, despite them being in their 20s, and they said, well, when you watch something, you know, like SpongeBob, you should turn your brain off. Unfortunately, I lack the ability to just, like, turn my brain off. I like engaging with stuff that's both entertaining and engaging. I like thinking about the movies and stuff that I watch, the books that I read and everything. And properties like SpongeBob and Rick and Morty and, like, Two Broke Girls and, like, The Big Bang Theory, you know, we shouldn't say that these are, like, subjective. We should just say that they're bad and stop giving them excuses. They're going to keep on being really bad unless we, like, you know, shape up the entertainment industry and start encouraging original thought and like, new ideas. But that said, that's really my thoughts on the death of the author, TV tropes. which I think is a really stupid website, because you just can't boil every movie and like TV show down to tropes, because not everyone uses tropes. Some people just have an imagination, you know. Sometimes it just happens. That's about it for this little analysis. I think it's important to always be kind of hesitant about these kind of pseudo-intellectual terms. It's crazy how many people just accept, like, oh, the death of the author, the death of the author. Here's an idea. To borrow another aphorism, don't shoot the messenger. Let's have the life of the author, you know? Let's read a book and think about who made it, instead of just being like, the author's dead, because I'm just reading this book and I'm doing whatever the fuck I want. Instead of like learning something from this book, I'm going to just say that this book applies to my beliefs. And I think that's especially bad in the case of, like, you know, dangerous conspiracies, or, you know, far-right groups. They can use any book to justify their insane worldview. They can probably use Dr. Seuss to justify their insane worldview. And, you know, that's something to watch out for. I think it's important to have a canon explanation for everything out there, every piece of art. Maybe not every piece of art. Like, like I said, if the artist is okay with there not being a canonized explanation, that's fine. But you should listen to the person who makes these things, just to kind of get, you know, an idea of what they mean by it, because you know, that'll kind of give you more of an understanding. So yeah, that's this video. I think it's kind of stupid, but what do you think? Tell me down in the comments. And buy Nicholas comics. Sayonara, suckers. Blackberries are really good.